By late 1942, the Eastern Front had split into simultaneous crises. In the south, Soviet forces were preparing the encirclement battle at Stalingrad. In the center, the German-held Rzhev salient still projected toward Moscow, tying down large formations on both sides. In the north, Leningrad remained under siege, and Army Group North held a broad line from the Gulf of Finland to the forests and lake country east of the Baltic. Soviet strategic thinking in autumn 1942 treated these fronts as connected. Stavka sought a sequence of winter offensives that would force the Wehrmacht to defend multiple sectors at once, limiting its ability to shift reserves by rail. The logic was operational rather than symbolic. German reinforcement depended on a finite set of rail junctions and road nets, and the northern theatre mattered because it protected routes to Leningrad and the rear areas of Army Group North. Within this framework, the Kalinin Front received a set of tasks that ran parallel to, and in places overlapped with, Operation Mars. Mars, coordinated at the highest level to strike the Rzhev salient, aimed to degrade German forces in the central sector. The northern component, commonly summarized as a Valdai Hills offensive, had a supporting purpose: to pin German formations on the boundary between Army Group Center and Army Group North, and to threaten the flank of the German 16th Army. The expectation was that pressure in the Valdai Hills would complicate German decisions about where to allocate winter reserves and artillery, and would reduce the chance that units could be moved south or toward Rzhev at short notice. The geography shaped everything before the first shots were fired. The Valdai Hills region was not a single ridge, but a belt of elevated ground, dense forests, lakes, marshes, and narrow corridors of passable roads. In 1942, it offered few all-weather routes for heavy vehicles. Villages were small and widely spaced, and the road network often reduced to one-track forest roads that became choke points under shelling or when thaw and refreeze broke the surface. For an attacker, force concentration was difficult. For a defender, a limited number of approach routes simplified minefields, pre-sighted artillery fires, and the sighting of strong points. Winter added a second layer of constraint. Temperatures regularly dropped well below freezing, which could improve cross-country movement for infantry, but also increased mechanical failures and fuel consumption. Snow depth and forest cover reduced visibility and hindered air observation. Medical evacuation and ammunition resupply depended on sleds, narrow-gauge routes, or truck columns forced onto predictable roads. These were conditions in which an offensive could consume men and materiel without producing rapid operational depth. On the Soviet side, the commitment of forces was large by the standards of the northern sector. Across the Kalinin Front, several armies and supporting formations were drawn into winter operations in late November 1942, with total strength commonly described on the order of 500,000 personnel in the broader effort. The intention was to translate that manpower into a breakthrough by combining artillery preparation, infantry assault groups, and limited armoured support where the terrain allowed. Soviet planners also relied on the idea that repeated pressure along a wide front would identify weak sectors and force the Germans to reveal and spend reserves. The German 16th Army faced these plans with a different set of assumptions. Its defence in the forest and lake belt emphasised depth, prepared field fortifications, and controlled withdrawal where needed to avoid encirclement. German strength was lower than Soviet totals, but its advantage lay in established positions, surveyed artillery zones, and a defensive system designed to absorb attacks on narrow approaches. The German operational priority in this period was to hold the northern line with predictable losses while preserving mobile elements and artillery for decisive sectors. Information and perception also mattered. Soviet intelligence had to estimate German reserves and fortification depth in terrain that restricted reconnaissance. German intelligence, for its part, tried to infer which Soviet attacks were main efforts and which were intended to fix units in place. Both sides entered the winter with incomplete pictures, but the stakes were clear. For the Soviet command, northern pressure was part of a broader winter plan that depended on synchronized offensives. For the German command, holding the 16th Army front helped keep the entire northern theatre stable, while battles elsewhere demanded attention. This is the precondition for the outcome that later appeared paradoxical on paper: a major Soviet commitment in manpower and artillery, operating in a region that limited maneuver against a defence optimised for exactly that kind of ground. The coming weeks would show how coordination across fronts, the timing of supporting attacks, and the practical limits of movement in the Valdai hills could turn a large offensive into minimal territorial change, with casualties that Soviet accounting later placed at roughly 80,000 across the campaign period. On 25 November 1942, while the Red Army was already executing the Stalingrad encirclement in the south, Stavka launched the winter offensive package in the centre and north. In the public record, the central effort became known as Operation Mars, aimed at the German-held Rzhev salient. In the northern sector, the Kalinin front was directed to conduct concurrent attacks in the Valdai Hills region, to bind German forces on the seam between Army Group Centre and Army Group North, and to create operational pressure against the German 16th Army. The opening phase was therefore defined by simultaneity, multiple offensives beginning within days of each other, competing for artillery ammunition, transport capacity, and headquarters attention. The Kalinin front command structure in late 1942 reflected a high tempo of operations. Several field armies held or approached the forward line east and southeast of Staraya Russa, along a belt of forests and lakes where frontages were wide on the map but narrow in practice because movement collapsed into road corridors. Soviet planning documents emphasized repeated penetration attempts by reinforced rifle divisions supported by artillery groupings, with engineer units tasked to breach wire and mine belts. Tanks were present, but often parcelled out in small numbers because the terrain restricted massed armoured manoeuvre. Where armour could be used, it tended to be employed to exploit short ruptures rather than to drive deep on open ground. German 16th Army headquarters anticipated winter attacks, and the defensive system it relied on was already mature by late 1942. The front line was not a continuous trench in the Western Front sense. It was a chain of strongpoints anchored on villages, road junctions, and higher ground, connected by patrol routes and covered by registered artillery fires. Behind these positions, reserve companies and battalions were positioned to counterattack along the same road nets the Soviets would have to use. The defense aimed to force Soviet assault units into predictable axes, where minefields, machine gun belts, and artillery concentrations could be applied repeatedly. The first Soviet moves in the Valdai sector consisted of artillery preparation, followed by infantry attacks across snow-covered clearings and forest edges. The opening engagements tended to be local and sequential rather than a single dramatic breakthrough attempt. Rifle divisions advanced toward identified German strongpoints, attempting to seize villages that served as nodes in the German defense. Gains, where achieved, were typically measured in hundreds of meters to a few kilometers, and often at the cost of high immediate losses among assault companies exposed on approach routes. Weather and terrain immediately shaped command decisions. Snow reduced the speed of infantry columns and complicated the positioning of heavy artillery in forward areas. Forest cover made it difficult to observe fall of shot, so artillery often relied on pre-registered targets and limited correction, which reduced effectiveness against well-dug positions. Engineering tasks expanded rapidly, clearing mines in frozen ground, building corduroy roads, and maintaining narrow tracks for ammunition sleds. Units that reached the edge of a German strongpoint frequently found that their supporting weapons lagged behind on congested routes, and that casualty evacuation competed with resupply on the same few roads. Soviet operational doctrine in 1942 emphasized shock and momentum, But in this sector, momentum was hard to sustain. When an assault group took a forward trench line or a village edge, the next bound required crossing another fire-swept gap, often without the ability to shift artillery rapidly or bring forward anti-tank guns and mortars. German defenders exploited this pattern by yielding forward outposts when necessary, and then counter-attacking against isolated Soviet penetrations, using short, rehearsed movements along interior lines. These counterattacks were not always large. Their purpose was to restore the integrity of the strongpoint chain and to prevent Soviet units from widening breaches into exploitable corridors. Coordination, with the broader winter offensive plan, also mattered in the opening phase. The Kalinin Front attacks were intended to contribute to a combined operational effect with Western Front actions in the Mars area. In practice, the fighting in the north unfolded on its own tactical timetable. Communication delays, the friction of moving artillery ammunition forward, and the difficulty of synchronizing multiple armies across forested terrain meant that attacks often arrived as staggered pulses. For the German command, this was advantageous. It reduced the chance of simultaneous crises across adjacent sectors and allowed local reserves to be used repeatedly, rather than being forced to choose between two emergencies at once. Civilian presence in the immediate combat zone was limited compared to earlier phases of the war, because many villages had already been evacuated, destroyed, or depopulated during the occupation and earlier fighting. Where civilians remained, they faced a survival calculus shaped by winter, shelter, food, and exposure. Front lines that shifted by a few kilometers could still bring artillery and requisitioning into a village, and the movement of both armies through small settlements typically consumed remaining livestock, stored grain, and building materials for fortifications. The result was that even without major territorial transfers, the opening phase intensified local devastation. By early December 1942, the pattern of the opening phase was established. Soviet forces were committing large infantry formations into terrain that prevented rapid concentration and forced advances through narrow corridors. German 16th Army defences were absorbing the attacks through prepared positions, registered fires, and localised counterattacks, aiming to trade space only when necessary and to prevent any Soviet penetration from turning into operational depth. The next stage would be shaped by planning choices, whether to double down on the same axes, shift to new approach routes, or attempt wider coordination with adjacent fronts whose own offensives were encountering comparable friction. By design, the Valdai Hills effort was not conceived as an independent campaign with a single geographic prize. Its strategic logic came from sequencing. In late 1942, Stavka wanted German operational reserves to face simultaneous demands. The Stalingrad sector in the south, the Rjev salient in the center, and the Leningrad and Lake Ilmen sector in the north. In that framework, Kalinin Front operations in the forest and lake belt had two linked aims. First, to fix German formations that might otherwise be moved toward the Mars battle area. Second, to create a credible threat to the rearward communications of the German 16th Army, especially road and rail movement feeding the southern approaches to Army Group North. Soviet planning assumed that pressure along a wide front could convert into localized ruptures and then into operational penetration, even in difficult terrain. The intended method relied on artillery groupings, engineer breach teams, and reinforced rifle regiments tasked to seize strongpoints in sequence. Where vehicles could move, small tank groupings and self-propelled guns were expected to support the assault and exploit short successes. In practice, the terrain imposed a different geometry. Approach routes funneled into predictable corridors, so the Soviet plan required not just a breakthrough, but also the rapid expansion of that breach into adjacent forest compartments to prevent German counterattacks from sealing it. The command relationships reflected the broader winter program. The Kalinin Front was commanded by Colonel General Maxim Purkayev. while the Western Front, the other main participant in Mars, was commanded by Colonel General Ivan Konev. Marshal Georgy Zhukov served as a Stavka representative, coordinating Mars-related operations across these fronts. This structure mattered because it created competing priorities in resource allocation and timing. The central thrusts of Mars demanded artillery ammunition, bridging equipment, and engineer assets on a scale that strained the winter logistics system. The northern supporting attacks therefore had to be planned with what remained available, even as their success depended on weight of fire and steady resupply. Logistics dominated feasibility more than map objectives. Soviet supply moved from railheads to forward depots by truck where roads permitted, then by sled columns, hand-carried loads, and short-haul teams over forest tracks. Ammunition expenditure had to be budgeted in advance, because resupply cycles could take days in snow and sub-zero temperatures. Artillery doctrine required sustained fires to suppress dug-in defences. But in this sector, guns could not always be moved forward quickly enough to keep pace with infantry, and the observation needed for accurate adjustment was limited by forests and short winter daylight. These constraints encouraged a pattern of repeated set-piece attacks against the same identified strongpoints, because shifting to new axes required time to cut routes, reconnoitre minefields, and reposition artillery. German planning began from a different set of assumptions. The 16th Army, subordinate to Army Group North, expected winter offensives and built its defence around depth and predictability. Strong points were placed to dominate the few usable routes, and artillery was registered on likely assembly areas, road junctions, and forest clearings. The German goal was not to hold every forward outpost at all costs. It was to prevent a penetration from becoming a corridor wide enough for Soviet forces to pass supply and reserves. In a region where both sides were tied to the same roads, the German defence treated counterattack as a routine maintenance action, restoring the strongpoint chain and forcing Soviet units back into exposed approaches. Both sides faced material limits. Soviet forces possessed large manpower pools in the aggregate, but their ability to apply that strength at one point was restricted by transport and the narrowness of approach routes. German forces had fewer infantry replacements and chronic shortages of motor fuel and vehicles, increasingly relying on horses and fixed defences, but benefited from established positions and interior lines along their communications net. The planning clash therefore centred on time and coordination. The Soviet side needed synchronized pressure to overload German reserves. The German side needed the attacks to arrive in staggered pulses that could be met with local reserves and artillery. Public messaging did not track operational reality. Soviet wartime reporting in this period emphasized major outcomes, especially in the south, while secondary offensives in the north were often described in generalized terms or omitted, and Mars itself was not presented as the decisive winter battle it was intended to be. German communiques tended to report defensive success as the holding of positions and repulse of attacks, without detailing the scale of local engagements. The result was that the Valdai Hills offensive entered the historical record as a peripheral fight, even though its planning assumptions were tied directly to the same winter logic that governed Mars. The opening phase had already shown what this planning produced on the ground. Attacks constrained to narrow axes, a logistical system that struggled to sustain high artillery density over time, and a defence designed to exploit exactly those constraints. The next question for both commands was whether changing the method, shifting sectors, altering the scale of artillery preparation, or attempting tighter synchronization with the Western Front could convert pressure into measurable operational depth, rather than repeated, limited advances. In the last week of November 1942, the Valdai Hills fighting moved from planning maps into a sequence of assaults along multiple narrow corridors. Soviet units crossed start lines that were often only a few kilometers from German fieldworks, but the approach was rarely direct. Assault companies had to pass through forest belts, frozen swamps, and lake edges where movement compressed into single tracks. That compression made early engagements predictable. Men and supply columns converged on the same clearings and village streets that German artillery observers had already registered. The first engagements typically began with short artillery preparations, followed by infantry attacks aimed at taking a forward strongpoint or a village that controlled a road junction. Soviet engineers tried to cut lanes through minefields and wire in frozen ground, while machine gun and mortar teams provided covering fire from forest edges. German defenders answered with pre-sighted artillery and interlocking small arms fire from dugouts and log bunkers, often allowing Soviet infantry to close into the outer belt before firing at full density. When Soviet units reached the first trench line, the fight became a close-range contest for individual firing bays and shelters, with progress measured by which side could keep ammunition and replacement crews moving forward under shelling. Territorial change in this opening stage was uneven. Some Soviet attacks gained a few hundred meters, seized a forward outpost, or took part of a village, only to be pushed back the next day by a localized German counterattack moving along the road net. Other assaults failed at the mine belt or the first line of wire, leaving casualties concentrated in the same approach lanes. The map therefore showed frequent indentations rather than a continuous shift of the front. Small salients created by short penetrations, then erased when German reserve battalions restored the strongpoint chain. The German 16th Army defense was built to exploit this pattern. Rather than counterattacking everywhere, German commanders tended to strike where Soviet units had advanced beyond their supporting weapons. If a Soviet rifle regiment took the edge of a position but its mortars, anti-tank guns, and ammunition sleds were still stuck on a forest track, a German counterattack could isolate the forward companies and force a withdrawal. These actions were often limited in scale but repeated in rhythm, making the Soviet effort feel continuous at the tactical level while producing little cumulative depth. For Soviet commanders, the immediate problem was not simply German firepower, but the inability to turn local success into sustained exploitation. Forest cover reduced artillery observation, and guns that could not move forward quickly kept firing from rear positions with limited adjustment. Tanks and self-propelled guns, where available, were forced onto the same roads and village lanes as supply columns, making them vulnerable to mines and anti-tank guns covering road bends and bridges. The result was that even when an assault broke into a position, the next bound often began with reorganizing battered companies and rebuilding supply access rather than expanding the breach. Casualties accumulated in a way typical of winter fighting in constricted terrain. Losses were heavy among assault platoons, engineers clearing mines, and runners moving orders between companies when radio sets failed in cold and wet conditions. Frostbite and exposure added to the evacuation burden, competing with ammunition and food on the same limited transport capacity. Soviet accounting for the overall campaign period later placed losses on the order of 80,000, and the opening weeks established the mechanisms that produced them. Repeated assaults along predictable corridors, limited visibility for fire correction, and counterattacks that prevented small gains from becoming operational progress. Civilian impact, though less visible in the record than in mobile campaigns, was persistent. Villages in the combat belt served as shelter, supply points, and strong points. Buildings were dismantled for fortifications or burned by artillery. Where civilians remained, they faced displacement, requisitioning of food and livestock, and the risk of being caught between shifting strongpoints. Even when front lines changed by only a few kilometers, artillery range and patrol activity could alter daily survival conditions immediately. An early turning point emerged not from a breakthrough, but from divergence inside the broader winter plan. While these Valdai assaults stalled into a pattern of localized advances and reversals, other nearby operations drew attention and resources, reinforcing a sense that the sector was consuming manpower without producing a clear operational payoff. For German commanders, the opening phase confirmed that the terrain allowed a defense based on depth and routine counterattacks. For Soviet commanders, it signaled that achieving the intended effect, binding German reserves for the wider Mars effort, would require either tighter synchronization with neighboring fronts or a change in method that could overcome the corridor problem rather than repeatedly feeding it. In December 1942, the fighting in the Valdai Hills sector entered an escalation phase without a corresponding expansion of operational space. The Soviet winter offensive plan required synchronized pressure. Western Front and Kalinin Front were attacking the Rzhev salient under the larger Mars framework starting November 25th, while adjacent northern operations were expected to keep German reserves tied to Army Group North. Instead, the calendar quickly diverged. By early December, Mars had become a series of costly local battles around prepared German defences, and the supporting attacks to the north were still constrained to the same narrow forest corridors that had shaped the opening week. For the Soviet command, the crisis was practical before it was strategic. A set-piece assault consumed artillery ammunition, engineer stores, and replacement riflemen at a pace that exceeded what winter transport could deliver forward. In this terrain, resupply often depended on a single road or track per regiment sector. When German artillery interdicted a junction or a bridge, a battalion could spend a full day rationing mortar rounds and small arms ammunition while waiting for sled columns to reopen the line. The requirement to keep attacking also meant that formations rotated through the front line under strength, with rifle companies entering assaults at reduced manpower, and with specialist teams, particularly engineers and signallers, repeatedly exposed. German 16th Army Command treated the escalation differently. Its defensive system was designed to absorb multiple attacks over time, and it relied on routine counterattacks to restore the strongpoint chain rather than on a single decisive battle. The forest and lake belt reduced the number of viable Soviet approach routes, and that predictability allowed German artillery to concentrate on known assembly areas and road exits. When Soviet infantry gained a village edge or a trench segment, German reserves were committed along interior routes to cut off the penetration before it widened into a corridor that could carry Soviet supply and guns forward. The effect was cumulative. Even small counterattacks, repeated, prevented Soviet commanders from turning a local success into operational depth. The wider northern theatre added a second pressure point. While the Valdai Hills attacks were consuming manpower, the front boundary zone was also shaped by the continuing struggle around the Demyansk area, where the German 16th Army maintained a tenuous ground link through the Ramushevo corridor to forces in the bridgehead. Soviet assaults against that corridor and against the defensive belt south of Lake Ilmen had a clear operational logic, but they demanded the same assets required for a breakthrough elsewhere: artillery ammunition, bridging and road-building engineers, and fresh infantry. This created a situation in which the Soviet side could intensify pressure in several adjacent directions, without achieving a decisive concentration in any single one. At the same time, the Kalinin front was heavily engaged in another major operation that competed for attention and logistics: the Battle of Velikiye Luki. That battle began on 19th November 1942, and Soviet forces encircled the city on 27th November. It continued into January, ending with the surrender of the garrison on 16th January 1943. The siege required sustained artillery fire, continuous supply movement, and repeated infantry assaults against prepared positions. Even though it was geographically distinct, it drew on the same regional railheads, truck parks, and artillery stocks that supported other winter actions in the northwestern direction. For Soviet commanders, this meant that the escalation in the Valdai sector unfolded while a major battle nearby imposed fixed logistical commitments that could not be easily reduced. By mid-December, the crisis was visible in outcomes rather than intentions. Attacks continued, but objectives were often limited to taking or retaking a village, a road bend, or a short ridgeline that controlled observation over a clearing. Territorial changes remained small and frequently reversible. The cost, however, was not small in aggregate. Casualties accumulated through repeated assaults, counterattacks, exposure, and the secondary effects of cold and transport delays on evacuation. German losses also rose, especially in forward strongpoints subjected to artillery and close-range assaults. But the defense achieved its primary requirement. No Soviet penetration widened into a sustained supply corridor that could support a deep advance toward the rear of the 16th Army. For soldiers, escalation meant a narrowing of time and options. Soviet infantry units faced repeated night marches through forests to form up for assaults before daylight, followed by hours of fighting, and then the labor of digging and wiring in frozen ground to hold whatever line had been gained. German infantry in forward positions lived in bunkers and trenches under intermittent artillery fire, with counterattack orders often issued on short notice when Soviet units entered the perimeter. Civilians still present in the combat zone experienced the escalation as repeated requisitioning, destruction of shelter for field fortifications, and the danger of artillery strikes on villages that served as strongpoints for whichever side held them that week. By late December 1942, the Valdai Hills effort had become a campaign of persistence rather than maneuver. The original intent, to contribute to a synchronized winter pressure system supporting Mars and threatening Army Group North, was increasingly undermined by the realities of constrained terrain, competing operational demands in the same theatre, and a German defence calibrated to make repeated attacks costly without conceding operational depth. By late December 1942, the Valdai Hills fighting reached its peak intensity not through a single decisive manoeuvre, but through the accumulation of repeated assaults across a constrained road and village network. Soviet headquarters faced a choice common to winter operations on broken ground: either reduce tempo to rebuild supplies and unit strength, or continue pressure to preserve the supporting role within the wider Mars concept. The decision, reflected in continued attacks through the end of the month, accepted that tactical gains might be limited while still aiming to hold German attention and prevent reserve movements. At the front line, the peak period was marked by Soviet attempts to widen earlier penetrations and to force crossings of successive defensive belts. Artillery preparation remained central, but in forested terrain, it often shifted from destruction to suppression. Planned fires on known strongpoints, road junctions, and likely counterattack assembly points. Engineers worked to open lanes through minefields and to maintain narrow tracks for ammunition and casualty evacuation. Infantry assault groups were reorganized around available specialists, machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank rifles, because bringing forward heavier weapons was frequently delayed by road congestion and shelling. Soviet tactics increasingly relied on infiltration in low visibility, including night movement and the use of ski-equipped detachments where snow cover allowed faster cross-country travel. The aim was to approach German strongpoints from less expected angles and to disrupt rear trenches, wire lines, and communications between village nodes. These efforts sometimes achieved surprise at platoon scale, but the terrain still forced larger follow-on forces back onto predictable routes if they were to hold and supply any gain. When small groups reached the rear of a position, they often found that without rapid reinforcement and ammunition flow, they became isolated and had to withdraw or consolidate in place until daylight exposed movement. German 16th Army responses during the peak phase remained consistent with its defensive method. Forward strongpoints were held as long as they could be supplied and supported by artillery, but local withdrawals were used to avoid encirclement and to draw Soviet infantry into pre-registered fire zones. Counterattacks were typically launched along the same interior routes that connected village nodes and road bends, seeking to cut off Soviet forward companies before they could bring up mortars, anti-tank guns, and field kitchens. The emphasis was on restoring continuity rather than pursuing deep counterstrokes, because the same terrain that constrained Soviet exploitation also limited German maneuver beyond prepared lines. High command pressures shaped the tempo in indirect ways, In the same period, the central Mars battle around the Rezerv salient was consuming manpower and ammunition without achieving a front-wide rupture, while the siege of Velikiye Luki continued to draw regional logistical capacity and operational attention. Soviet staff work therefore had to reconcile multiple priorities: maintain pressure in the northwest direction, sustain the Velikiye Luki operation, and continue Mars-related attacks. For German command, simultaneous threats created a different problem. Allocate reserves across sectors while protecting the integrity of the northern front, especially the lines feeding the southern flank of Army Group North and the approaches to the Lake Ilmen region. Losses during the peak phase reflected the repetitive mechanics of corridor fighting. Soviet casualties concentrated among assault infantry, engineers clearing mines, and small unit leaders exposed while moving along narrow approaches under artillery fire. German losses concentrated among garrison troops in strong points, subjected to repeated bombardment and close-range assaults, and among reserve elements used in frequent counterattacks. Medical systems on both sides were strained by distance, cold, and transport limits. Evacuation routes competed with resupply on the same roads, and delays increased the likelihood that wounded men remained forward for extended periods. Civilian experience, where civilians remained in the combat belt, was defined by displacement and the conversion of settlements into military nodes. Villages used as strongpoints were repeatedly damaged by artillery and fires. Buildings were dismantled for bunkers and firing positions. Stored food was requisitioned or destroyed as units rotated through. Even when the front line shifted only slightly, the change could determine whether a settlement became a rear shelter or a forward position under daily fire. By early January 1943, the peak had produced a clear operational pattern. Soviet forces could generate repeated tactical crises for individual German strongpoints, but the German defense could usually localize those crises and restore its line before a supply corridor formed. The campaign's intensity therefore translated into attrition and disruption rather than into measurable operational depth, setting the conditions for the next phase: adaptation and selective disengagement, as both sides adjusted to what the terrain and winter had made possible. In early January 1943, the character of the fighting shifted from maximum pressure to adaptation. After weeks of repeated assaults, both sides had learned which methods were feasible in the Valdai Hills environment and which produced predictable losses without changing the operational situation. This was not a sudden pause imposed by a single decision. It was a gradual adjustment driven by depletion, winter logistics, and the persistence of German defensive depth. Soviet adaptation began with how units were used. Infantry formations that had been committed in successive waves were reorganized around reduced manpower and limited specialist availability. Assault roles were concentrated into smaller groups with a higher proportion of engineers, submachine guns, and mortars, because these elements could influence close-range fighting around bunkers and village strongpoints. Ski detachments and reconnaissance groups were employed more systematically to identify mine belts, flanking paths through forest compartments, and weak links between German strongpoints. The intent was to shift from frontal pressure against a known node to a method of disrupting the connections that allowed the node to hold: supply tracks, messenger routes, and lateral trench lines. At the same time, Soviet commanders tried to improve survivability and sustainment. In practice, this meant more time spent on route maintenance, camouflage, and dispersal of supply dumps to reduce the effect of German artillery. Field fortification increased, not only to hold gained ground, but to protect assembly areas and gun positions from counter-battery fire. Where roads were the only viable lifelines, engineer units built bypass tracks and reinforced bridges, accepting that each new route became a target once German observers detected it. These measures did not create operational depth, but they reduced the volatility of the front line by making Soviet positions less fragile to routine German counterattacks. German adaptation also had a clear logic. The 16th Army defensive system depended on a predictable rhythm: absorb an attack, use artillery to isolate the penetration, then counterattack to restore the strongpoint chain. By January, German commanders refined this rhythm to conserve infantry. Strongpoints emphasized concealment and fire discipline to delay revealing positions until Soviet assault groups entered effective range. Minefields were replenished and extended along likely approach routes, not to stop attacks entirely, but to slow them and force infantry into gaps covered by machine guns and mortars. Artillery allocation increasingly focused on interdiction, shelling road junctions, bridge points, and forest exits where Soviet ammunition and reinforcement columns had to appear. Resource management became a central feature of adaptation for both sides. On the Soviet side, ammunition budgeting tightened as priority shifted to operations elsewhere and as winter transport constraints persisted. Units that had expended their most experienced assault personnel could not be rebuilt quickly in the field, leading to shorter attacks with narrower objectives. On the German side, infantry replacement shortages made it risky to conduct aggressive counterattacks without clear necessity. This encouraged a defense that relied more heavily on fortifications, mines, and artillery to do work that would otherwise require infantry strength. Morale and psychological strain in this phase were shaped less by ideology than by conditions and repetition. For Soviet infantry, the burden was the cycle of night marches, assaults through mine belts, and the effort of holding exposed positions in deep cold with limited shelter. For German infantry, the burden was sustained bombardment, isolation in forward bunkers, and the expectation of counterattack duties on short notice. Both sides experienced uncertainty created by forests and limited visibility. Small patrol contacts could be interpreted as the start of a larger infiltration, and communications failures in cold conditions increased the role of local initiative and rumour. Coordination issues with the broader Mars effort became more explicit in January, as the central battles around the Erzhev salient failed to produce the intended breakthrough. The supporting logic for persistent pressure in the north weakened. Continued attacks in the Valdai hills still fixed German units locally, but the strategic payoff depended on a larger operational success that was not materializing. This created tension in Soviet planning between maintaining pressure for its own sake and preserving combat power for operations with clearer prospects. German command benefited from this shift. With no Soviet corridor opening toward the rear of the 16th Army, German staff could treat the sector as an attritional defense problem rather than an impending operational crisis. This did not remove pressure. Attacks continued and losses continued, but it reduced the likelihood that reserves would be forced into a decisive commitment. The defense could remain methodical, reinforce threatened nodes, rotate depleted battalions when possible, and maintain artillery dominance over approach routes. By mid-January 1943, adaptation had produced a more stable front line without producing a breakthrough. Soviet tactics were more selective and more reliant on small unit infiltration and engineering work, while German defences were more focused on interdiction and conservation of infantry. The result was a campaign that continued to consume men and material, but increasingly lacked the conditions for a turning point in the attacker's favour, setting the stage for the final phase, recognising limits, reducing tempo, and ending the operation without the territorial and operational outcomes originally sought. The turning point of the Valdai Hills offensive was not a dramatic collapse or a breakthrough. It was the moment, in late January 1943, when both commands adjusted their expectations to match what the sector could realistically produce. The campaign's original purpose had been to contribute to a synchronized winter pressure system linked to Operation Mars, and to the wider intent of constraining German reserve movements. When Mars failed to achieve a decisive rupture in the central sector, the northern effort lost the strategic mechanism that would have transformed persistent local pressure into a theatre-level outcome. On the Soviet side, the turning point took the form of a gradual shift in operational priorities. The Red Army had finite offensive capacity even with large manpower numbers, because that capacity depended on transport, artillery ammunition, engineer stores, and the availability of rested assault infantry. By January 1943, these resources were being pulled towards sectors with clearer operational payoff. The conclusion was implicit in orders and in the tempo of attacks. Continued pressure could be maintained at tactical level, but the conditions for a sustained penetration in the Valdai hills, wide supply corridors, rapid gun displacement, and continuous reinforcement had not been created, and repeated attempts were not changing that fact. This shift was reinforced by concurrent developments in the same region. The battle for Velikiye Luki was nearing its end, with Soviet forces tightening control as the garrison's options narrowed and the surrender approached on January 16, 1943. That victory provided a concrete territorial and operational result. It disrupted German communications in the northwestern direction and forced German command to expend forces in relief attempts. As a result, Soviet planners could point to an achieved objective in the broader theatre, even as the Valdai Hills attacks remained a pattern of attrition and limited advances. In operational terms, the Soviet system began reallocating effort toward consolidating gains, restoring unit strength, and preparing for subsequent actions, rather than continuing maximum pressure assaults in a sector that had not yielded operational depth. German command recognized the same turning point from the opposite angle. The 16th Army defense had succeeded in its primary requirement: prevent a Soviet corridor from forming and keep the front structure intact. Once it became clear that Soviet attacks were not escalating into a new offensive peak, German planners could shift from crisis management to stabilization. This did not mean a withdrawal from defensive positions. It meant that local reserves could be used more predictably, battalion rotations could be planned where rail and roads allowed, and artillery could return to a steady routine of interdiction rather than emergency concentrations. The defence remained costly in manpower, but it no longer appeared at risk of a sudden operational penetration. The turning point also had a human dimension. By this stage, both sides' frontline units had accumulated fatigue that reduced the effectiveness of repeated assaults and counterattacks. In forests and snow, even short movements required disproportionate effort: hauling ammunition, maintaining shelters, and evacuating wounded. The tactical learning curve had matured. Soviet infiltration groups could sometimes force a German position to withdraw from a forward line, but they could not reliably convert that into a widened, supplied breach. German counterattacks could restore local lines, but they were increasingly designed to be limited and economical, avoiding unnecessary exposure in terrain where visibility was short and mines were pervasive. Civilian implications of the turning point were indirect but real. As the tempo of large assaults decreased, the front line became more stable, which reduced the frequency of villages changing hands. Stability did not mean safety. Artillery still struck junctions and known positions, requisitioning continued, and the winter environment remained a threat. But stabilization affected patterns of displacement and survival. Where civilians remained in the combat belt, they experienced fewer sudden shifts in authority, while continuing to endure scarcity and the destruction of remaining shelter and infrastructure. In practical terms, the turning point can be summarized as a change in what each side was trying to achieve. The Soviet side moved from attempting operational penetration to seeking limited tactical improvements, intelligence gains, and a reduction in exposure to counterattacks, while preserving combat power for other directions. The German side moved from defending against an escalating offensive to managing a contained threat through routine defensive measures, rotating units when possible, and holding the strongpoint system that the terrain favoured. The campaign's momentum did not reverse. It drained away, leaving a stabilised line and a record of heavy losses that were disproportionate to the territorial change. This turning point explains why the Valdai Hills offensive is often treated as a forgotten component of the Mars period. It did not end with a visible breakthrough or a major encirclement, and its outcome was defined by what did not happen. No deep penetration, no collapse of the 16th Army front, and no decisive effect on German reserve movement beyond the local sector. As January 1943 progressed into its final weeks, combat operations in the Valdai Hills sector moved into an aftermath phase characterized by reduced tempo, selective withdrawals from exposed salients, and consolidation rather than expansion. The end of the offensive was not marked by a formal armistice or a single concluding battle. It was a practical termination. Attacks became smaller and less frequent, objectives narrowed to tactical corrections, and both sides focused on stabilizing lines that could be held through the remainder of winter. On the Soviet side, the immediate driver was force condition. Rifle divisions that had been committed repeatedly over 2 months had accumulated losses in assault infantry, junior officers, engineers, and signals personnel. Even where overall manpower remained high on paper across the front, the specific units tasked with breaking prepared positions had been worn down. The operational effect was visible in the type of activity: reconnaissance in force, limited assaults to improve a trench line or seize a forward outpost, and heavy emphasis on artillery harassment rather than large infantry pushes intended to create a supply corridor. Logistics reinforced the shift. The winter transport system could keep the front supplied at a holding level, but sustaining major offensive density required concentrated ammunition delivery, continuous engineer work on routes, and rapid movement of guns forward. The sector had not developed the road depth needed for that cycle. As a result, Soviet headquarters increasingly treated the Valdai Hills area as a fixing front rather than a breakthrough front, preserving artillery stocks and rested formations for operations where terrain and operational context offered a clearer chance of decisive results. German's 16th Army also adjusted in ways consistent with its resource situation. The defence had held, but it had done so at a cost in infantry strength and in the wear of units repeatedly used in counterattacks. Replacement shortages and winter conditions made it essential to reduce unnecessary exposure. German actions therefore emphasized maintaining the strong point chain, improving field works, replenishing mine belts, and rotating battalions where possible. Local withdrawals occurred when a forward position became too expensive to hold relative to its tactical value, but these were controlled and aimed at preserving a coherent defensive line rather than conceding operational depth. The front line in this phase became more static, but not quiet. Artillery exchanges continued, particularly against known junctions and suspected supply routes. Patrol clashes and small raids remained common, partly to gather prisoners for intelligence and partly to prevent the opposing side from preparing a renewed assault unnoticed. In forest and lake terrain, such small actions could still be lethal because mines, ambushes, and short-range fire dominated encounters. However, the scale of operations indicated that both sides were prioritizing sustainability over major movement. Civilian consequences in the immediate aftermath were shaped by the stabilization of control rather than by liberation or occupation in a dramatic sense. Many settlements in the combat belt had already been damaged or depopulated. For those still inhabited, the continuation of a static front meant continued requisitioning, forced labor for fortification work, and the persistent danger of artillery fire. Infrastructure remained degraded. Roads were cratered or reduced to rutted tracks, bridges were temporary, and medical and food supplies were scarce. Stability reduced the frequency of sudden displacement, but did not restore normal life. The end of the offensive also produced an administrative aftermath. Units on both sides compiled casualty lists, redistributed replacements, and reorganized depleted formations. Soviet accounting for the campaign period later placed losses at approximately 80,000, reflecting not a single catastrophic engagement, but cumulative attrition from repeated assaults, counterattacks, exposure, and evacuation delays in winter conditions. German losses were also significant, concentrated in forward garrisons and reserve elements used in frequent local counterattacks, though the defensive system's aim was to trade casualties for time and positional integrity rather than for territorial expansion. In operational terms, the conclusion left the strategic situation largely unchanged in the Valdai Hills sector. Soviet forces did not achieve a breakthrough into the rear of the 16th Army, nor did they create a sustained threat that forced German command into major redeployments away from other fronts. German forces retained a coherent defensive line that continued to protect Army Group North's southern approaches. The outcome was therefore defined by limited territorial adjustments and by the expenditure of combat power for both sides. This aftermath phase sets up the final question of historical significance: how a large-scale Soviet commitment in manpower and sustained effort could result in minimal territorial change, and how the campaign's supporting role within the Mars period affected its later visibility in narratives that focused on more decisive winter outcomes elsewhere. The legacy of the Valdai Hills offensive lies in how it illustrates the interaction between strategy, terrain, and coordination in late 1942 and early 1943. In Soviet planning, it was one component of a winter system intended to force the Wehrmacht to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. In German planning, it was one of several expected winter pressures to be contained by prepared defences while higher priority sectors demanded attention. The result, measured in territorial change, was limited. Measured in manpower expenditure and operational friction, it was substantial. Strategically, the offensive helps explain the limits of the broader Mars concept. Mars depended on synchronized pressure across fronts to overload German reserves and to turn local penetrations into operational depth. The Valdai Hills sector was intended to contribute to that synchronization by fixing formations on the boundary of Army Group North and complicating German redeployment. When Mars failed to achieve a decisive rupture in the central sector, the supporting actions in the north could not deliver a theatre-level payoff on their own. In that sense, the Valdai Hills fighting became a dependent operation whose value was tied to an outcome elsewhere. Operationally, the campaign is a case study in terrain unsuitable for offence dynamics. The Valdai region forced both sides into predictable corridors, villages, road bends, bridges, and forest exits. This reduced the attacker's ability to concentrate forces without presenting targets and reduced the ability to exploit success because any deep movement required a widened, protected supply route. It increased the defender's ability to pre-register artillery, mine likely approaches, and shift reserves along interior lines. Even large manpower totals could not fully compensate for a geometry that turned movement into bottlenecks. The German 16th Army defence demonstrated a method suited to these conditions. Strong points tied to the road net, depth rather than a single line, and routine counterattacks designed to restore the chain before breaches widened. The defence did not require large-scale manoeuvre. It required predictable logistics, disciplined use of artillery, and a willingness to yield or retake local positions as necessary to preserve the system. This approach aligned with German constraints in 1942 to 1943, including limited replacement flow and growing transport shortages, while still enabling a stable front. For the Soviet side, the campaign underscores how doctrine and resources interacted with environment. Soviet operational concepts emphasized breakthrough and exploitation, but in this sector, breakthrough required sustained artillery density, rapid engineer route building, and the ability to move guns and supplies forward quickly. Winter logistics and forests reduced those possibilities. The Soviet response, repeated assaults, later supplemented by infiltration, ski detachments, and narrower objectives produced tactical crises for individual strongpoints, but rarely produced conditions for operational depth. The cumulative casualty figure later associated with the campaign, approximately 80,000, reflects attrition mechanisms consistent with this environment: repeated assaults through mine belts, predictable approach routes under registered fire, and a high evacuation burden in extreme cold. The civilian legacy is quieter in the record but direct in consequence. Where civilians remained, the offensive period meant repeated requisitioning, destruction of shelter for fortifications, and the conversion of villages into strongpoints subject to artillery. Depopulation, ruined infrastructure, and winter scarcity persisted regardless of which side held a settlement for a given week. For the region itself, the campaign reinforced a pattern of war in the forest belt. Prolonged instability without major map movement, producing long-term damage that outlasted any immediate tactical result. Historically, the Valdai Hills offensive is often subsumed under the larger Mars period because it lacks the markers that drive narrative attention. No widely recognized decisive battle name, no large encirclement, and no dramatic territorial shift. Its significance is therefore interpretive rather than visual. It shows how Soviet winter offensives could be designed as mutually supporting actions, and how failure in the decisive sector could leave supporting operations appearing purposeless in hindsight despite their original logic. It also shows how German defensive methods in 1942 to 1943 could convert difficult terrain into a force multiplier, producing stable lines even under sustained pressure. As a forgotten component of the Mars disaster, the Valdai Hills campaign contributes a specific lesson. Large-scale commitment does not guarantee operational breakthrough when coordination across fronts is imperfect and the environment prevents the attacker from translating local success into supplied depth. The campaign's outcome was not the absence of fighting, but the absence of a mechanism that could transform repeated tactical engagements into strategic change.